used to stand here every day and blab at people, and now I don't. Now I work for the University of York in its central management team. So for me, this is a bit of a treat. Not at all of us on top of that. I'm chairing this afternoon in here. Rob is going to chair the Huntington Room sessions when we split again. But we've got 2 sessions now where we're all together, so that's splendid. I'd like to start by introducing to you 3 Italians. They are completely Italian. Okay? They come from ICCROM, which is the International Centre for Conservation in Rome. It was founded in 1956 by UNESCO as an intergovernmental centre. So it is an independent body, but supported by governments from around Europe. And very closely associated with the conservation studies endeavour at the King's Manor for the whole of our careers. Here at King's Manor since the early 70s. Another good link here is that Gaimini, who is going to speak now, was my very first research student. Looking back on it now, it feels like when I was about 19 and it was a bit scary. So that's a very nice link. And our ICCROM speakers are Sarah Court, Jane Thompson, and Gaimini Wijesuriya. And as I said, they are all Italian, so I think we're going to have an Italian case study here. And we look forward to hearing from them about a people-centred approach, improving engagement and conservation and management capacities for cultural heritage. So I don't know who wants to kick off on. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, James. First of all, thanks to the university, to all the partner organizations, and to Jill and Pam, in particular, for hosting us and giving us this opportunity to share our experience and listen to the others. This joint presentation based on our recent work at ICCROM, development ICCROM. It is a great pleasure to come back to York, even though it has taken 22 years to pay tribute to and respect to people like you, Jane, and the university. I began to explore a theoretical base for my work as a conservation professional. At the age of 28, I was given the responsibility of managing World Heritage in Sri Lanka. So I needed some breathing space, some theoretical basis, and so on. I'm particularly pleased to see that, Jane, you are chairing this session. In fact, I was an architect. But when I decided, I was Director Architectural Conservation in my designation. So when I decided to go to York, there were questions about my choice. Instead of the well-known King's Manor, they asked, why are you not going to King's Manor? You know, they are the architectural masters, famous masters, people here. I opted to go to Micklegate House. So the answer was, and that's where I decided. I never regretted my choice, and indeed I'm glad to observe later merging Micklegate and King's Manor. I think that's something that we also have changed. The whole notion of conservation, these 4 architects of conservation architects, we try to change. And I came to York to compare, contrast, or even justify the work on restoration of Buddhist monuments. Cultural heritage belongs to a living religious tradition in my country, Sri Lanka, and about which Jane and I have talked. These were some of the work we've done. And among the topics was the so-called pious vandals, I hope you remember them, who restored religious buildings. Pious vandals being the term used by Western scholars who went to Sri Lanka for the communities taking care of their own heritage in the 1940s. Something about which Dan and I talked a lot, and I read the program article also. Yeah, these are the pious animals. Coming to York at a time when there was only, I would say, one approach to conservation under discussion, and approach heavily dependent on the Western conservation discourse, with understanding and defending the contribution of these communities to heritage partnership work. It left me essentially asking the right questions about these pious vandals and returning to the field with more confidence to begin to answer them. 6 years later, I was entrusted with the task of restoring one of the most sacred religious places in Sri Lanka, the Thompson Temple, and also a World Heritage Site, bombed and destroyed by terrorists. As a living heritage site, I had the opportunity to reflect on my work at York, and some confidence. I kept the known Bibles, such as Venice Charter, to one side for a moment, and started engaging with what matters most to communities and custodians of this heritage. This was formed in 1998 and was destroyed. And this is the custodians are the chief Buddhist monks and a lay custodian appointed for 10 years. They are the most powerful Buddhist monks in the country, having 2 sects. And I, as the director of conservation, had the task of conserving to undertake the restoration job. Because of the importance of the place, the president, a lady at that time herself, chaired a committee for restoration with all the ministers and so on. And we were called up and we were told, do what you like, but all the decisions are, final decisions are to be approved or taken by the chief monks. So what do you do? Yes, even the country where President ICCROM was living was my guru and mentor all the children. And where I have studied conservation here, there, England, UK, US, and you are told that all your decisions are to be subjected to or taken by the custodians. We had enough of money. We wanted 40 million, we were collected because people like making, they like to donate, and we collected 100 million. And of course, we looked at the process and okay, rather than leaving the job and running away, we sat together with the Buddhist monks and the society around them. And I think we were successful in understanding, because the way they look at heritage, way they perceive heritage, is not just the materiality and everything else. And this is a place where over 100,000 people gather in a given full moon day, and there 1 million gathers in special procession on a in the month of August, and where arms or food is prepared with 32 dishes every day for the Buddhist, Buddha, and so on. Let's try this. Sorry. So, anyway, that started rethinking my conservation approach completely, and we started looking at the entire chain to the decision-making process. This case study helped us to begin to turn around the idea of community engagement within the existing conservation discourse. The assumption that heritage processes are led by professionals. The community involvement in something which is somehow shoehorned to embellish our efforts. The Sri Lankan case study highlighted that there are large parts of the world where there is another paradigm, where heritage isn't for heritage, it's just part of the community life, and therefore it is natural for communities to care for it. And when professionals try to shoehorn themselves in this context, they can go wrong. The experience proved hugely influential in the program launched at ICCROM on the weekend, dedicated to those sites that continue to perform the function for which they were created, and in the development of some research resources and tools later in the presentation. In 1998, I did this restoration work, and in 2000, I was able to join ICCROM's activities on the Living Sites program, and from 2004 November, I was able to join it as a staff member and continue with the Living Sites program. The example of the two credits reminds us that the fundamental concept of culture has been by people for people, and the idea of cultural heritage as central to well-being of the society. Something that is more explicit in other heritage typologies in use as well, such as cultural landscape and historical landscapes. All heritage places have been subjected to change, yet continue to survive, often adapting to time, while even the word continue to be stolen, while maintaining their historical identity and integrity, until such time we began to call them heritage. New approaches are then needed for their conservation and management to balance continuity and change and not dramatically alter their enduring character. In many ways, heritage which continues to perform functions for societies hasn't faced that divorce from present society. The isolation that the museumification process that many Western management systems have created, and with the negative repercussions for entire management system, the conservation approach. Instead, living heritage approach in which continuity is the core theme. We are talking about more joint approach, continuity of knowledge, most direct connection to livelihood and thus social, economic, and environmental values. Those areas where capacities reside, institutional frameworks, more heritage practitioners and communities and networks, often acting more in unison. Local community as the primary management system, in some cases, primary stakeholders central in decision making, not just in a secondary role. this has led to greater emphasis at ICCROM on a people-centered approach to conservation and management, where communities in particular are central to promoting the mutually beneficial dynamic between heritage and society. This is, I have not seen, because of the time, I am not going to explain the people-centered approach or the living heritage approach, but it is a moving forward from conventional approach, which is expert-driven, as you can see here, and to values-based approach, where you are talking about getting consultation from many stakeholders, but still dominated by the experts, to a more people-centered approach, more community voice, and so on. ICCROM's role as an advisory to the World Heritage Committee gave us an opportunity to explore and promote these new ideas, developing research, policy, and guidance, in particular the management manual and capacity building strategy. Jane and Sarah will continue from here on the management system and capacity building. Of course, we had to change certain things. We needed to promote, we need more than one approach to conservation. There exists more than one approach to conservation. So we needed input from specialists that believed in more than approach to conservation and management of heritage, and had the capacity to look beyond the heritage sector. We needed to tap into strengths of those working in the field and challenging the circumstances in Mediterranean region particularly and beyond. 4 or 5 years ago, Jane Thompson joined me to look at heritage management systems, and her contribution has seen her co-authoring the 2011 World Heritage Capacity Building Strategy and the 2013 Manual Managing Cultural World Heritage. Sarah Court is here, who will come next. After Jane is helping us develop a program for promoting a people-centered approach and engaging communities in all their diverse forms, natural follow-up from her backstage contribution to capacity building strategy. And they seem British, but their experience comes from Italy, Germany, that. So with that, I will thank you very much.
Hello, good afternoon, and thank you for having us. I'm going to happily use some of Cameron's last slide. We were talking about living heritage also being something you find in these qualities going through other heritage typologies like cultural landscape and industrial heritage, especially in recent memory. And the very quality that can be found in many examples of living heritage are something that makes us reflect when we find ourselves in situations that aren't working, just what is going wrong. And part of the work inspired by also by UNESCO World Heritage funding for new guidance and resources was to focus very heavily on trying to understand the patient, diagnose the problem, break up into as many simple parts as possible what's actually happening, and try and find that common ground. Now, clearly, the whole point of Gaimini examples from the world, from the information elsewhere, is that we're not looking at this. We're not looking at the simple situations where a single heritage authority, without talking to anybody, looks after a lot of heritage. What we're looking at is much more complex as society's changed. We have multiple players, multiple interest groups, and they're not just confined to the geographic areas within and around property, but they even happen far, far away in the form of non-users and other communities of interest. So you're trying to understand what's happening in a very complicated scenario. And it's in this context that we started to look at management systems. And the expression of this work is in the 2013 manual that you can download from the word for free, which is something we like. I would like to briefly take you through some of its core thinking. If we departed from what is a common established idea of management systems above and beyond the heritage sector, the idea that it's a sort of framework that hosts a series of processes and they together deliver a set of results. And this is the very important bit. Those results also feed into the system and create an upward spiral of continuous improvement. That's why we still come to universities to discuss things, because we're trying to always do things better. So with that kind of, finding what's sort of broader understanding of management systems, we began to look and hone down what's happening in heritage management systems. I'm now going to take on a little journey. This is the world. This is some heritage somewhere in the world. And of course, it never happens in simple pieces. You've got a few pieces of heritage, a few heritage places. And the first component, we tried to hone it down into a series of things that come together to make a management system to encourage a common language. The first fundamental bit, we call the legal framework. Essentially, we're talking about a mandate, something much looser. It's the reason that the thing happens, the decision to care for something, protect it, access something, save it for future generations, whatever. The word mandate doesn't translate well into many languages, so we use the language framework. It defines the heritage as its criteria for being conserved, managed, used, and so on. The second piece of the puzzle, we pin down as institutional framework, that organisational thing that lets action take place. And the third is that the sort of the oil on the wheels, the human, financial, and intellectual inputs that create operational capacity and facilitate processes. So we've got three elements. We've got the thing, but it's not enough. Management is the activity of getting things done with the aid of people and other resources. We need some action. So the next three components, we identified as three processes. The diagram suggests they're sequential, but of course they overlap inevitably and positively. Planning is understanding the who of decision making, deciding what objectives to reach, what actions to take, and what the time frame will be, and recording these proposals so to act upon them, to communicate them to others, and to review progress at every stage, going back to that idea of constant improvement. Implementation is taking the action planned, checking they deliver the actual outputs required at every stage, and checking they come together to achieve the broader outcomes and set of objectives at the outset. In the case of disparities emerging, making changes midway for how actions are taken as the actions themselves, as and when necessary. Monitoring. Monitoring, again, we had to hone it down to a very simple language, but it's obviously evaluation, review, it's trying to encapsulate everything. Collecting and analysing data to check that the management system is operating effectively and delivering the right results, and to identify remedial measures in the event of shortcomings or new opportunities. And that monitoring takes a series of forms, from monitoring the management system itself to monitoring the property and broader outcomes. So we now have three elements and we have three processes. So we've got the thing that exists and we've got it doing things. What is missing? The why. Management is the judicious use of means to accomplish an end. And obviously, essentially this should be the first part, because what we also often fail to do is not get up in the morning and remember why we are doing what we're doing, and asking that question often enough. The overriding objectives to be achieved by the management system, we've called outcomes. Now this is a division we get in many other sectors. There's loads of jargon around how to describe results, but we've differentiated between outcomes as the overall objectives of the management system. Outcomes reflect the changes to or continuity in the existing situation that has been sought in the planning stages. The aim in focusing on outcomes is to check that the management system is achieving its objectives. So achieving objectives. Whereas outputs deliverable results. Outputs are those things that come directly out of processes. They're often quite tangible, measurable products, services, actions from a planned work programme that constitute direct support for heritage and to society at large. These outputs are necessary in order to achieve outcomes. Clarifying outputs is central to understanding heritage processes and their effectiveness. Are you delivering? And then, goes back to the original concept of management and constant improvement. We've given results, as one of our 3 results, we've identified improvements to the management system, that is extracting from the process knowledge for future practice is as important as achieving your current outcome. So improvements being those corrective measures and feedback, either from external inputs or from within the management itself, management system monitoring, that allow us to achieve continuous improvement, which is central to management. It can lead to changes in the management systems that achieve greater effectiveness and efficiency. So we now have a total of 9 components, 3 elements, 3 processes, and 3 results. We like number 3. And we have a heritage management system. And you're basically looking at the being, the doing, and then the relating, the obligation to achieve something for others, for all those involved. And this reasoning can work both at the national scale, the regional scale, it can work at the site scale, it can work even at the project scale in terms of being a basis of a common framework for understanding what's happening. To go to essentially what are the ultimate heritage outcomes, one of the 9 components, a management system for cultural heritage conserves and manages a given property or group of properties in a way that protects heritage values and, where possible, enhances wider social, economic and environmental benefits beyond the confines of each property. So we're looking at, in terms of the theme of this conference, the reason to exist, some of the outcomes are also that of broader engagement. And this engagement has multiple benefits, including deterring practices detrimental to cultural heritage, but also facilitating the identification of the promotion of property heritage values. Moreover, it delivers the cultural heritage a constructive role in embracing, enhancing human development, which in the long term will bring a return, augmenting the sustainability of the cultural heritage itself. The resource manual online follows through this analysis and proposes a kind of common template for understanding, analysing, and defining heritage management. And a significant aspect of it, with all the limits of something that tries to kind of have common ground from Bolivia to Russia, is that it is precisely trying to address the sort of common perception of a lot of heritage literature that this is what is happening. And take on board this whole shift of thinking that the nature people have been particularly good at pushing through, of what it means, nature people, because they have lots of them, what it means to have multiple private owners, users, and so on. To take on board this complexity that we mentioned earlier. And the template, as a result, and we just zoom in on this bit, is trying, and it's obviously in its place, it's trying to acknowledge that layering of multiple management systems is often contributing. And those of us who work in countries that maybe have a massive management system that's inefficient, or a very minimal state management system, or an unmotivated state management system, and often we'll find ourselves with the last column being the most significant, because what would officially be the state management system is actually the smallest player in many scenarios. So we're trying to sensitize the user to that level of contribution. This overall interest in management systems is all aimed at this sort of broad vision of envisaging a world where practitioners, institutions, communities and networks are enlightened, capable and closely aligned in their work to protect world heritage and heritage in general, and to give it a positive role in the life of community. It's about understanding where things are going wrong so we can address them and achieve more well-being for heritage and society together in Scamming Fair. And the mission is essentially that of being a catalyst for the development of wider cooperation for heritage conservation in general. Now here I'm not quoting the resource manual, I'm quoting the World Heritage Capacity Building Strategy, which is utterly inseparable from the resource manual in terms of the tools that you need to understand where things are going wrong and how you can address them. And with that, I'll hand over to my colleague, Sarah. Yeah, just in case you're all sleepy after lunch, you get 3 speakers when you wake up. That's the current capacity building strategy. Capacity building is something that everybody seems to be talking about these days in the heritage sector. It's important to note that we don't need to start from scratch. In fact, it would be wasteful to start from scratch. Other sectors, and this is why we're creating UNDP, have made huge leaps forward in identifying exactly what it means. Starting from the basics, what is capacity, what is it we're building up? Capacity is the ability of individuals or organisations to perform functions and solve problems. Which means, if we're doing capacity building, we're trying to strengthen those individuals and those institutions, strengthen their knowledge and their abilities and their skills. Which poses the question for lots of people, why are we trying to shift from training to capacity building, especially an institution like ICCROM, which has been doing training very well for a long time? Why are we bothering to make the shift? Is it just a question of language? Training, which is similar in many respects, is not exactly the same. Training is developing knowledge and skill, and in the conservation sector, it is often done training for conservation professionals. So capacity building is actually trying to deal with a large number of people, a large number of audiences. I know lots of people here are getting irritated by language, but it's there to try and find a common way of communicating. And it's also putting an emphasis on the people-centered approach, acquiring knowledge. It's not just knowledge transfer, it's people acquiring knowledge. Well, why bother? I mean, it's all well and good that there's such a difference, but why are we bothering? Well, we would suggest that times have changed. It's not enough to be Heritage United Nation anymore. There's been a big paradigm shift and we need to move with it. In 2015, there are a lot of challenges facing heritage, and there's a lot being required of heritage. It's being asked to play a bigger role in society. At the same time, there's an increasing number of threats being faced. So in response to that new way of heritage acting in modern society, we have to change with it. And these thoughts have led to 3 questions that were posed at the beginning of the capacity building work. Where are the capacities? Where do they reside, these capacities that need strengthening? What audiences are there that need, where we can target them to make improvements? And what kind of learning environments do those audiences need? So it's all very exciting. You can see that these were the 3 audiences that were identified: practitioners, institutional framework, and for this conference, most important, communities and networks. So there are 3 audiences identified, and then target audiences. You see it's attempting to be a quite logical step forward. You can see under practitioners, individuals and groups who are directly working. The institutional frameworks, it's decision and policy makers. And the communities and networks, I would be terrified to define them. So for now, we get. And then there are some key learning areas that's identified where progress needs to be made, working with communities. Now again, this work that ICCROM is doing for UNESCO, it can be seen very much in terms of what other sectors have been looking at, and it's very similar to the UNDP approach. So we have these 3 areas where the capacities reside, and today we are, because we're at this conference, looking at the community section, we would
aim through capacity building to introduce a more dynamic relationship between heritage and its context. Okay. So, enough to keep this reading slide. We bring this back to concrete case study, and I was very glad yesterday that everybody started producing photos of their favourite thing in the local village, which gave me the wonderful excuse to put in slides of Naples, which is where I live. And in particular, there's a neighbourhood which is of great interest, the Rio Sanità, which is right in the centre of Naples. I'm only sorry that my photo collection it just doesn't show the vibrancy, the dirt, the noise, the wonderful chaos of the neighbourhood. It is one of the oldest neighbourhoods, really central. It's got a lot of amazing, wonderful people, lots of problems, lots of poverty, lots of unemployment, lots of crime. We get it, it manages to do it. And for a long time, it was one of those neighbourhoods you just didn't go to, that you're advised to avoid, and that I live in the neighbourhood next door, and we, my family, we go there to buy cakes on Sunday, also good for cake. I was advised by my neighbours, 2 streets down, don't go there, it's dangerous. That sort of isolation that can get built up. What was interesting about this neighbourhood is that one day the community woke up, and this was in part led by one single community leader who happens to be the priest there, Don Lafredo, who identified that community, the neighbourhood had 2 major strengths. One was an awful lot of amazing heritage, from the church to big, what's called in English, residential apartment building. That's glorious. This is Thompson, who is one of Italy's most famous actors. He was born there, so it's very much associated with the neighbourhood in a kind of Polish outfit. And the second element that the neighbourhood has is lots of young people with lots of skills. From, and this is the cover of the book that Susan ended up writing about, with these young people, they go from very practical skills through to more tour guiding, archaeological, knowledgeable, who've done lots of training. And they set up a series of associations to make the best of both. So the association is a huge theatrical tradition in Naples. Lots of musical traditions, so there was another one set up to get the young people involved in music. Modern art used as a way to stimulate people to respond again to their heritage, which is the an earlier Basilica under the existing one. And then after a while, it was a bit more ambitious, and it took them a lot longer to get there because they were fighting the heritage authorities over this. They got to start managing their own heritage. They went from not just simply having guided tours in the neighbourhoods, they started taking over the heritage. This is a case of the catacomb under the neighbourhood, where they started doing everything from looking at the lighting, to doing the conservation work, from making sure that it's accessible to disabled users. Everything that's occurred here has been promoted by the local association of young people. The second major heritage site they have is the cemetery, which is an incredible place to go. And again, they have managed to take over management of this and offer it, give back access. So opening up the neighbourhood. One of the key themes, giving back access to not just the local residents, but the whole systems of Naples and beyond. And doing so in a way that is respectful to the fact that this is still a cemetery that's used. For a long time, because it was closed and inaccessible, the relationships were beginning to erode. This is something where a certain generation of that community still bring objects and make requests. It's incredibly unusual. I've also been from the background. They go and they talk to people, they polish the gold. You often go and adopt one. They're not necessarily relations with your family, but there are connections that you make. And you make your request, and it's quite a wide range of requests, including quite a few jobs. They're quite pragmatic people in Naples. And in this context, looking at the management systems, they have become the institutional framework, they have become the practitioners, and they have become the community, and they are, and always have been, the community members. it's an interesting case study, which you've seen in 2 seconds, because it's part of what I think a lot of people want to promote community involvement and like to see, where it's not just superficial engagement, but it's where the community has all of their capacities strengthened, they participate meaningfully, and they're making decisions for themselves. The program that we would suggest, looking at that case study, the analysis that we have done, is unfortunately, whilst the community element is really strong, the big weakness is we don't know how long it can last. It's been a glorious, I think it's about 15 years now they've been doing it, how long that can last in a total, what's the English? Yeah, I'm sorry. The total void. These people are have no support from the institution, as the heritage authorities or the local authorities. There are not many practitioners who are involved there. There is no one offering them support. There's nobody listening to them and what they're achieving. We would suggest that if you're going to capacity develop, capacity build, it cannot just be with a focus on the community. It's 1 of 3. We desperately need to also develop capacities within practitioners and institution frameworks that mean that we as a sector are also capable of supporting the communities when they're already empowered to do their own work. If in this dream world where we all super develop, the aim of all this work would be, over time, there would be strong organisational frameworks, there would be better interfaces between heritage and the wider world, and then you can start having reciprocal benefits. There's a heritage benefit and a community benefit, and heritage will start playing a more central role in society. Thank you.
While we swap over, there's time for a couple of questions. I'll make some time for some questions at the end as well, so that people can keep going. Does anybody have a burning question to ask at this stage?
The last speaker, with your case study, you said how the institutions don't support the community in their work. Has the community tried to reach out to the institutions and then tried to make that connection?
Yeah, when you speak to them, it's very interesting. They spend a long time. They have been obliged to go through certain bureaucratic processes. Some of the heritage is would be state managed, and some is church managed, and they reform from both fronts to get any progress. And they were blocked for many, many years of doing anything more than simple walking calls. It's ironic that the number of obstacles actually created by the institution, and anytime they want to reduce it, there's one practice example, they want to conserve painting in the main basilica, and they applied for permission to do it, and they're going to be professional property statement, and the heritage authority said they're going to take it away. But they didn't have any funding to do conservation work, they just simply couldn't believe it to stay in situ at that point. They were really alarmed, really possibly on conservative. And there was then a very big fight once they managed to keep it in situ, go through all the hurdles necessary to get it to be certified professional. It's astonishing that for a minute, showing interest is actually detrimental. And for a while there was a lot of people saying, this is going to tell the authorities what we're doing, they don't come anyway. We'll just do what we want, or we think the laws will do it. And so it's become, it's not just that there was a lack of institutional support, in some cases it was real terror that the community possibly engaged in real damage.
Yeah, it seems to me that there is an issue there about getting communities tooled up and technically in a sort of clear control of what they're doing, so that they understand what they're doing. And I think the answer that as a community, you break down the walls of the authorities. So Alison, for instance, as the community, part of a right thinking manner, said, give me a place, and we can sort that out. Yeah, in order to try to make sure that the community is feeding into that top circle, I think, and then that top circle of trained professionals kind of tend to know how to deal with the authorities in a technical way, and the community, of course, knows how to put the squeeze on in the political way, like the moving members. So there are ways in which you can make that circle work in this country, but I suspect it's very, very variable, and it often depends on the source of one personality, like yours, or like Thomas, or somebody who is going to really push it forward. So thank you very much. We'll probably want to call that back. Can I hold it later? So that we can keep the time. Sure. So there will be, hold your thoughts, because we'll do some more questions afterwards. Sean O'Reilly is the director of the Institute of Historic Building Conservation, which used to be the Association of Conservation Officers when I first joined it. So it was very much a kind of, it was a sort of home therapy group of people at the top of the circle, the people who were the practitioners. And it's rather widened its remit, and I think it's quite an interesting way.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm not sure they ever felt they were at the top of that, but anyway, everyone seems to feel they're always in the middle of some of these situations. But thank you for the invitation, and thank you to Jill for asking me along, and also for not putting me up in one of those parallel sessions things there, because you kind of imagine everyone's going to go out to the other speaker, and you're left there with just sort of yourself and the other person who turns out to be the person who's speaking after you. They go in the middle of your talk as well, and it just gets into a disaster. So it's a big relief, you know, people are relatively stuck here. In terms of what I'm going to be talking about, which you can leave if you already. In terms of what I'll be talking about, it's a very interesting comparison with what we were looking at, and I think a big positive tick to Jill in terms of that, because I think she probably noticed that the synergies there, because where that we were just looking at was a huge, big overarching set of issues being explored. I'm going to look in very much on a very practical detail where there is a potential solution if partners get involved, but also one that can serve as a kind of a model for issues that we've been coming across already through the discussions yesterday, and in particular the discussions this morning as well, and just now about how do we connect across between these different areas. I call it perfect partnership. Actually, I've been trying to sell this idea for 5, maybe 10 years, so it's probably better being called towards a perfect partnership, because we've probably have a long way to go. I also apologise for the shadow texts there. This is a template that's gone through many moves between Mac and Microsoft and all of that, and I decided I couldn't be bothered trying to sort it out. So first of all, just look at the structure and then look at the context, and I think understanding the individual backgrounds to the ideas, which is a little bit about me. It's important, not because it's about me, but because it's shaped the kind of thinking, and that kind of gives a very specific context. So you can see them all and then extrapolate. Then I look at the sketch plan, looking at how we can get that kind of more efficient participation between the different circles that we are looking at just now, and then offering a model that's just a model. It's an idea that might be followed up. There's a million other ones that could be used in those terms, but it's one that I know, and I think it's one that would have a potential value in those terms. A little bit about me. I'm the director of the IHBC, as Jane said. I'm previously director of the Architectural Heritage Society of Scotland, which was National Amenity Society for Scotland in those terms. Very much kind of a parallel on a slightly different level to the IHBC as a professional body. They're both voluntary bodies, very substantially relying on volunteers to carry out work, 5, 10 FGs, supplementing the kind of core staff. AHSS, very much a lay area, IHBC, professional. One doing casework, the AHSS, the IHBC doesn't do casework, it deals with processes, principals, support, education. Both very flat in their structures, so they're, as I say, not a lot of centralization. The IHBC doesn't have an office beyond what it gets as service provision, as a bolt-in service provision. So very, very flat, and again, requiring lots of kind of soft communication. Membership about 1,000 for one and 2,000 for the IHBC, both very much involved in policy advocacy, delivering services for membership, which generated the income and the freedom to do the kind of work that we're doing. And also, of course, promoting access, which is a fundamental part of what conservation is all about, and actually fundamental to what we've been talking about for the last couple of days. So it's an aspirational background, but also very pragmatic as well. Just to sort of give you a sense of what the IHBC is and does, I don't need to go through them, but it does provide web resources are very important, keeping those as accessible as possible. The Web Starter is a tool that's developed for students, particularly to help them access the 30,000 or so web pages that we have, but it also is sufficiently accessible for anyone to use, anyone in the civic society or somebody to sit down and start building up their knowledge of what this very complex world of heritage and conservation is all about. We do events, notify other events, we get involved in consultations, project development support as well, including partnerships with organisations, whether it's the National Heritage Training Group or COTAC. We get involved in different ways with events and programs. And also, we have a big program of offering digital access to our training events, which are geared towards professionals, in as open a format as possible, so that non-professionals, as well as professionals who weren't there, could actually engage in those processes. And there's a lot of that education is around doing nice, interesting site visits and fun things like that, including Orkney in the sun, which is a rare event. That's a sort of a way to engage and break down those barriers. One of the problems is the barriers, and we call ourselves a professional body so we can feel like another professional body, but yeah, that's part of the problem that we're facing in these situations. That's one hand. The other hand then is where we are in the UK. This is where I'm saying honing down into a particular area, the UK planning system. And for me, that planning system is really the management system that the people were talking about, the people were talking about before. It is one manifestation of that. In the UK, planning is there to balance public and private interest. Government is at the centre of that. It is a wonderfully democratic strength. It doesn't always work, but that strength is fundamental to how planning works. Government, the local planning authorities, the local government manage the public interest in change and development. They have that particular role, and communities and indeed individuals can input into that planning process. In the context of heritage, it's about the volunteers who are interested in heritage. But broadly speaking, it's a fundamentally democratic system that manages things, not just heritage, but within that system, heritage is part of that. And of course, there's a huge democratic deficit, because the input into this process is usually on the heritage end of things by unresourced lay or voluntary organisation objectors. There are people who put in their comments, which are fundamentally around objection, because that's the way the planning system looks at it, and put in their comments into the planning process as an objection. As an objection to, of course, it's often stigmatized as being unskilled, it's lay, it's not important. What do these people know? And they're interested in it. They're biased. They just don't want things to change. So we can set their sort of comments aside. So by the fact that they're volunteers, by the fact that they're interested, they lose out some of their credibility within that process. However, those comments go in. They go in as objections, as I say, because right back to the start of the planning system, 100 years ago in the UK, and the requirement was that the people who are doing developments and are managing them, the local authorities, were required to listen to the objections of informed, interested parties, the architects and the archaeologists. And so the whole way of thinking about it was, when we consider place in terms of heritage as we think of it now. It was, you stop the development by someone rejecting. It's a kind of stigma, another stigma that we've not really gotten away from. And then the local authorities consider those objections in the planning process where those points are material, where they are relevant to what's going on in planning. A lot of the time people don't really understand even what's material. So that's another of the problems they face. And of course the local authorities also, particularly these days, lack capacity to actually manage those contributions to planning. They don't have the capacity, the time to delve into the issues that are coming forward, or they don't have the skills. But that public participation, as I say, is central to the heritage planning. It's around amenity, which is a very important concept about the goodness of place, the well-being of place in itself. It takes in ideas like character and interest. And it comes in through conservation, it comes in through archaeology, particularly within English planning policy development recently as well. You're looking at these areas very much as part of that. Those contributions are coming in a lot of the time through the local interest, through the individuals, or the civic or amenity interest. And of course, there are very fundamental limitations within the context of getting that idea of here's a change that's going to happen in our planning process. Here's an objection to that change that says I don't like that change because, well, you know, maybe I live next to it or whatever, or I don't like it, and then the local authority has to say, well, what do we do about that? You know, it's an objection to something that someone wants to go ahead. We've got to manage it, and that's what the planning system in this context is about. The limitations very clear, very easy, about capacity within the volunteers, about the skills available to those volunteers, and about the volunteers being undervalued by the who are listening because they're unskilled or unable to articulate. And we were hearing yesterday about the difficulty people face in articulating their concerns because they are non-specialists. That doesn't make them wrong. Sometimes they do often just talk about heritage because they can't think of a better word to describe the issues that they're talking about. And heritage is a legal framework of the planning system, so it's easier. So we all talk about heritage. But actually, they're still trying to articulate these things, and indeed I think we're trying to articulate them as well. And then all of that, those limitations means that their contribution is reactive. It's not proactive. It's just like, I don't like this, I don't like that. That is the way the system is generated. And what I want to think about is some of the challenges at the overarching level and how we might respond to those challenges. Learning is one of the problems. There's a huge inconsistency within the contributions of the skill set available to the people who make these contributions. And people are tagged as NIMBY, which is not my backyard types and things like that, or they're tagged as English because sometimes they are, sometimes that's what it's about. But the problem is you can't see these different textures and you can't see these different roles or levels of involvement. And the lack of consistency in skills very much is around knowledge of systems and understanding what those systems are and how those systems work. And very skilled people are still very unaware of these, what they are trying to do with these systems. And I think that's one of the big challenges at all ends of the process. It's understanding what the system is about, in this case, planning. And also limited understanding of change in heritage planning. Change, we talked about, the managing change, and you've quite rightly pointed out the limitations of that, managing continuity, all of that as well. But the limits to the understanding of even what we're doing when we're dealing with planning, and planning is a fundamental tool for saying what's going to happen to our heritage in the context of, as we have in policy in Scotland and in England, the policy of the historical environment, which is everything, not just the heritage, it's absolutely everything. Another of the challenges is capacity. Increasing demand on those volunteers. There's reduced local authority capacity, so local authorities are really looking for the whole help. Reduced central government capacity as well. So they're not able to do all they like to do, so they need to rely more on local volunteers and contributors. Planning system here, very much a light touch process, and the kind of political framework increasingly now very unsympathetic to these sorts of ideas of heritage or anything that might slow down jobs or anything like that. You also have these wider definitions of heritage, as I mentioned. On the one hand, the scale, it's the historic environment, it's everything. You can't say this is heritage and this is not heritage because there's going to be a value in there somewhere. And the values that we use in assessing the values of heritage now, infinitely more complex than what we were looking at before. We talked about embodied energies and life cycles and things like that, carbon emissions, all of that, but they're very difficult elements to come across. Yet these can be critical to make a response or a contribution material for consideration within the planning system. And also the process itself, the infrastructure supporting a kind of effective voluntary participation is absolutely stretched, both at the local planning authority or government end and the NGO side, where the NGOs too are finding more and more pressure being put on them. Capacity in terms of what informs the material input to the planning system, the contributions, typically objections, and also in terms of the skills within the local authority to actually reinterpret them. And this brings me to the kind of sketch plan for an idea, as I've told it here. And that's about enhancing this efficient participatory element to planning. The focus is on the planning system, but the principles are there about how one works with volunteers and how one can engage them efficiently within the process of planning as a participatory experience. First of all, we think about what we need to do. We need to address the skills primarily through common training. We get an understanding of what the skill sets needed are, and then we say that these are the skill sets we require of you. And in that context, you have people who are just general local volunteers, but you will very frequently, and in my experience in Scotland, invariably have someone within a community who's prepared to stand up and say, I'm prepared to take a lead in this. Not just in terms of saying what I want as an outcome, but in making a real contribution to the process so that I hope I can aspire to get it better. And to do that, they need to get the right skill set. We don't have a way for offering the skill set at the moment. That's a fundamental problem. So why don't we offer them? We agree and apply relevant and structured training that recognizes what the systems are that we're dealing with, and recognizing the common understanding across the different players within the processes, in this case planning, the common understanding so that you can streamline it. So you have the skill set within the voluntary interest and a skill set within the professional interest that have some sympathy or synergies across them. The better you can do that, the better the continuity. You also recognize the value of participation by skilled volunteers. So those lead volunteers, they're not just doing it because they like to be lead volunteers. They like to be recognized. I mean, it's a natural inclination, especially if you're going to have to work at achieving those skills. So you need to endorse and to recognize those skills across the training, across all the interests, and the training and the efforts that's put into it. You need to acknowledge the achievements of skilled volunteers, and you can do that very simply by type marking, for example, volunteers who have gone through training processes. And the model for this, and one of the kind of key examples of the American docent system, where they have trained volunteers that lead people around museums. And these people are skilled and they have a whole pipeline. I don't know how many people have come across this, or reached me recently as well. But the docent is a skilled, trained volunteer whose level of knowledge is to a particular level and recognized as such. And then you demonstrate to them the personal benefits of what they do. You articulate that individual value in the role by primarily promoting the effective participation through recognizing how these people are making a valuable contribution. You don't marginalize them as NIMBY, you know, kill yourself for doing that, shoot yourself for doing that. You shape and generate their values into the processes by recognizing what they do is more important than what is done by someone who doesn't have those skills. right? So you say, not only do we like you having those skills, we value those skills within the processes. And in all of that sort of stuff, you've got to regulate, because they are volunteers. Just like they're individuals, just like professionals and specialists, they're individuals as well. And in that context, they will have different approaches and different angles. In the context of a skilled volunteer working as a docent in a planning process on behalf of a community, they need to observe certain standards. Someone has to take ownership of both the training and the kite marking and the actual operations themselves, so that they make sure that they're effective and working to a general standard. And the benefits, well, you can skim through them yourself there. If you can get those processes streamlined, you're addressing issues around capacity, you're enhancing the value of what they do. You are also making, and this is critical, making those processes transparent, because people can see what the skill sets are. People can see how they're managed, and people can see that there is a regulatory framework that makes those docents, the contributions of those players, keeps them within a reasonable set of issues. So it's not just NIMBY, it's not just what I want, it's actually an informed contribution on behalf of the community. And those processes require kind of skills framework. You've got to have aspirational skill set for the non-professional people. You've got to have a common learning baseline, and then all of that generates recognized standards that apply to these people that are acting, as I say, on behalf of the community. So you're getting greater continuity across there, and also, of course, costs and cost reductions by the fact that you're getting informed voluntary contributions to the planning process fundamentally for free. Look at the little model, the model that I know, which is the IHBC one, and I'm going to talk briefly about that. But that's the one that, it's one that can be used. You can use any of the principles of that. I'll just look at it in the context of this. Conservation, as we were looking at, is an extremely complex process, however you actually approach it, which is why we have this impossible triangle here. And we use that, or I use that, as a way for introducing just the different elements that come together in the context of the IHBC's model for its skill set. ICCROM, absolutely at the heart, the guidelines for conservation skills and training from 1993. Project management also, we were looking before, you focus on outcomes as we were speaking in the last talk. You've got to be heading somewhere, so it's a project. Even if you're doing nothing is still a project because it's got an end point to it. So you've got to be thinking about something that will then make a contribution to what's happening. So you structure thinking. And then generic skills. We talked this morning briefly with Philip about the EGAN skill set, generic skill sets from the early 1990s. There's lots of different generic skill sets out there. But if you take the standards with conservation, the process with the project management, there's a world-back standard there around that, or project management for environmental projects, and generic skills, you can kind of begin to see that there's a sort of an overarching process that can actually draw these impossibly diverse threads together. And that's one side of the model, and the other side is we're going back to sort of some of the illustrations we were looking at earlier about the process of conservation. We have a very basic model around that. You can go to Geddes and Sir Patrick Geddes in terms of the survey analyse plan for a planning framework, and that's what we were looking at in the last talk. This is just saying, well, we evaluate something, we decide if it's worthy of having the effort of conservation. This is always effort of conservation, and we manage it. We have management processes. These are akin to planning in terms of core traditional mainstream professions, and intervention where you're actually changing. If you decide to change, we're going to change this, we may change it radically, we may demolish it, but that's the point at which the change is absolutely fundamental. And as I say, these correspond to broadly historical skill sets, history and archaeology for evaluation, management for planning, intervention for architecture, project management, those sort of things. Oh, sorry, and the point about that is that these are areas of competence. These are areas or skill sets that you assess on going in to become an IHBC member. And Henry Russell is here, spoke this morning, and he's on our assessment panel. And he looks at the skill sets of what people have under evaluation, under management, and under intervention. He gets a sort of a sense of, well, have they proven their competence there? All within the overarching professional or conservation framework. That's the one we've developed. Those different areas of evaluation, management, and intervention are professional. We can break down into what we call competences. You can test each of them, so you can go in through to the process through that. Is the person showing in their submission for IHBC membership? They know the philosophy, they know practice, they know history, etc., right through the 8 competences. And each one of those is assessed in terms of the evaluation. Those are the areas of competence and the competences. That's how we test competence within our members and how we assess and evaluate their skill sets. Now, the areas of competence is absolutely fundamental to how we think about standards and processes. And just to list through where we apply that concept right across our operations, you can see we've got it obviously in the membership and the assessment and discipline sort of context. The areas of competences, we also assess CPD. We get submissions in for people who are required to submit their CPD forms. We test them in line with that. We use the areas of competence as a framework for advertising our Gustafsby Student Award, which incidentally, the closing date for it is July 31st. So if you have students, let your students know that the 2014 one is closing then. We use it in our conservation course recognition process. We assess against those areas of competence. Our annual school assessment and evaluation, which is our annual conference, we do that too. Events, we do it there, and also in our online services listing for conservation. So the model applies across all of those areas. It also maps to, as you've seen with ICCROM, but also accreditation areas used by the Edinburgh Group, by the RIBA. It's not unique models, it's just a particular scale. But what's critical with this is these assessment systems can be used to assess the skills in volunteers. So if you have a skilled volunteer who has the knowledge, you can actually use these systems to test their knowledge. And if you can use the systems to test their knowledge, you can actually then say they're a skilled volunteer because they know about how planning works. They know about it's not just about stopping things happening because of their planning. They know about what a material contribution is within the planning system. And I'd never intended to go into that, I'm certainly not going into it now. But the point about it is, this is a grading of different levels of skills that is considered against the submissions by the assessors when someone makes an application for full IHBC membership. And it goes from unaware at the top right down to expert. And then they decide whether the person has demonstrated at what level across each of the 8 competencies. But within the second of those, you've got aware, which is about possessing basic skills. You call them beginner. These are all models that work across different areas. And you're able to do things like achieve some steps using own judgment, but supervision is essential as well. This is the area of a skill set that would apply to a trained volunteer who is working within the planning system. They can be assessed, their skills can be assessed, they can be given a role, that role can be recognized within the planning system, and if ideally would smooth, because people who are coming in at one end of the process as community and volunteers will be coming out, will be talking about the same terms and standards as those who are assessing them within the planning system. Is this about regressing issues like loss of resources? Well, you know, it really should be happening anyway. Obviously, there's loss of resources in local authorities that I mentioned before as an issue. Is it bad because it might be blurring voluntary or professional? It seems like almost a silly question, actually, after what we've been talking about over the last couple of days, but people still ask that sort of thing. I think it's just a bridge between them. In fact, you can develop the continuity across them as well. I've just 2 more slides. Threatening then, is it doing threatening the autonomy of public interest? You can see the reasons there. And adding administrative burdens, again, it's simplifying the processes. all of these are points that have been made before, including the issue around training with the future professionals, and also hopefully it would reduce capacity. And we can do questions and answers if you want.
I'm going to break into, thank you, I'm going to break into tea for about 10 minutes. Is that all right? Just so we get. Peter had a burning question. I think that we'll let him in now while everybody formulates their questions.
But I don't know whether it was sort of burning, but anyway, there was the second speaker from ICCROM was talking about a sort of cultural heritage model, to what extent this model is applicable to natural heritage. Because there's a feeling amongst a lot of people that we need to sort of bring these two things together, and any way in which we can do it is good. So, because I would have thought that that model probably is quite different.
Very, very different question, and Gandhi will agree, and we would be of the opinion it is utterly applicable. The World Heritage is investing more and more resources, also particularly Swiss funding, to try and understand increase resources and cooperation between the natural sector and the advisory bodies over the end of the World Heritage, ICCROM and Economic Cultural Heritage. That's the World Heritage. An enormous desire to build more bridges. Our work's often been inspired by the nature people because they've been dealing with private users, continuity, change. In some ways, they dealt with it sooner, and the whole body of work on environmental assessment and so on, they're often well ahead of us. So, yes, definitely. There's a specific program with me from building nature culture connections. Of course, Gaimini leads every 2 years on World Heritage. This year, especially the UNESCO module, which we took to where we work in Pennsylvania, all about nature culture. You can't talk about Pennsylvania without talking about pseudus and geology. So it's absolutely the topic at the moment. The nature manual from World Heritage came out a year before ours. And there was both parties commented on each other. The nature people are very, very proud of their management effectiveness diagram that come out of collaboration with WCCA. And they've tried to say that that's really doing what I was doing and kind of thing, that it's very much, but they've looked at the management efficiency. And I think the leap we made in that last couple of years is trying to come down with, I mean, it really is lowest common denominator of bits and pieces that make the thing work. And obviously for us, it comes out of a lot of courses and training environments where we're seeing problems from all over the world and trying to find common language. So yes, I think it will gradually evolve, and we'll see it also the framework improving as we get more feedback from analysts and marketers, which I think already been used in some countries. Where they sort of rewrite management system through World Heritage. So yeah, it's changed. It's become, we need feedback as well. So
actually, the target is to have one combined memory in 2 years' time. Yes, indeed. If you look at the nomination, yeah, actually, if you look at the nomination manual for both, and also this after this manual for both,
I've got a question on here. Is it connected or
Can I just say something very briefly?
Yeah.
Which is that I earnestly look forward to the day when natural heritage protection and cultural heritage protection legislation are integrated.
In many countries they are. Go to New Zealand, like Canada, or Denmark. We need to learn how to doing it.
Good.
I think Sean mentioned that you've been playing around with some of those ideas for a decade or so. This year is the 45th anniversary of the publication of the Skeffington Report, People and Planet. And what I wouldn't take issue with any aspect of Sean's model, but perhaps the potentially biggest value of it, it may overcome the inherent them and us divide, because Skeffington identified the biggest challenge in involving people in the community at large, or communities at large, in participating in the planning process, and engaging with what he called, the report called, the inarticulate non-joiner, or who doesn't join organisations, who hasn't the confidence to raise their voice as an individual. And by having a kind of a volunteer training program, if that could be implemented, that may help overcome that divide between them and us. It's them, it's us and us.
I think that's really another good reminder, actually, as well as the healing stuff. Because a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about and that I've been seeing over the last few days, a lot of those are things that really have at some stage been happening within the planning process that I was talking about. They may have been happening with a slightly different focus, with the going out engagement with the communities. This is all part of good practice in planning, and it should happen more, and it should happen with much more of a heritage awareness within it, and can in the context of what we've been talking about. But equally, there is a model structure there that we can actually focus on improving, particularly in the context of the UK, and particularly in the context of the barriers that we're facing here at the moment.
Yes, mine just, you know, in the interest of comparative rather than equity, but parity between the monitoring participants and the scientists. What about competence within
interface, but a very specific interface where we could look at improving things, which are quite right on that. And I think equally, if people get engaged with the planning system and see it having that engagement having a value, so too the volunteers will actually enhance their skill set because they will see there's a benefit coming to them from having got them involved. And the planning system has listened to what they're saying. So again, it's not just the specialists, it's right across the board. But I fully agree, and we were saying that as well.
Yeah, I'm quite used to the way these great things look through spaciously. You still ask a question earlier. How does the living heritage approach that you relate to the expert volunteer model? It seems to be in quite logic. I wonder if you could maybe speak about the friction of these things between heritage.
To the volunteer model.
Sorry?
Can you explain?
No, well, my reading or my understanding of the living heritage model is kind of that everyone is producing heritage and culture all the time, to the way they're living, the expertise they have as part of their engagement with the world. And that seems to be quite a different model than one that was being outlined by Sean.
They're not different models, they're sort of different points along a process, I think, because within the living heritage, as I understand it, is about skills, understanding, awareness, knowledge, and experience. But it's at a very different sort of, well, it doesn't put mine specifically in the context of
There's no deficit model at all.
sorry?
It feels a little bit like there's a deficit model within the deficit model of learning within the model that you've outlined. Like, people don't have skills, they need to get them. Whereas the living heritage model to me, the idea is that life is the talking about expertise. I might be simplifying slightly, but that's why I'm kind of wanting you to speak to each other about it and sort of work out what was going on.
I think that I'll try, but Sean said it's not really the position that's comparable. What came up quite a lot of recent research in ICCROM is that if you look at many other continents, whereas in the UK perhaps we've got living heritage in terms of how you maintain hedges, there's not an authority that oversees hedge institute. I don't know. I'm giving you a random example. A lot of agricultural land use practices is just word of mouth in heritage traditions. There's not an official system doing it. The community does it. In Glasgow Morning, I was community 10 years ago, so I did the Glasgow Morning in that country. In Asia, for example, a lot of what we see as traditional monuments, which also go into the hedge Glasgow Morning country, is not being finished for streetlights in Berlin. Things you would never thought of, particularly as heritage. And so you're finding equilibrium with management situation, which hasn't developed this idea of expertise. The expertise is within the community. Now, the base of when, and this is what Gavin was saying to the two-relic temple, when you need to perhaps introduce some expertise in certain situations and how that's introduced. He's not saying in a two-relic temple there was no expertise introduced. It's just the whole decision-making mechanism that the community, the users, the owners, the custodians on the same footing, if not a higher footing than the expert and the institutional framework these days. So it's just every situation. The UK is a very specific one. There's a different emphasis in the UK. For hedges, we have one approach, and for large monuments,
the planning system, it's got a whole other infrastructure to it. And it is again about how you interface that kind of local knowledge, capacity and awareness with the bureaucracy that is involved in the planning, and how you get the continuity across, rather than let those systems sit apart from each other, which I think is the problem that has been identified previously, and which we have here, because that's what stops the community having involved skills, understanding, knowing where they can fit within the process. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
And I think for the UK, a good understanding of late 19th century firearms in society as a whole helps you to understand why it's developed, because in a sense, those firearms are thrown into bureaucracy, and the unfreezing of them has been a very fraught process, and one that we're not able to do.
I want to make a very brief comment about key volunteers. It's not an objection, it's just an observation. I come from Greece and I work for an NGO, so I have a lot of things to do with volunteers, but I'm also from a country with a very high rate of unemployed people. And I think we have to be very careful about the thing of skilled volunteers and the percentage of youth volunteers in our country, because we are very often accused to use people instead of hiring people. And I think this is the point that we really have to bear in mind, where the limit between involving engaged community and in enforcing volunteerism, which is a good thing, and where this is used as an excuse for doing the heritage projects that we don't have the money to do.
The speed you gave at the end covered that was just a question. But the issue is the same here, because of course the conservation officer who is in the local authority doesn't want to find that their role is lost and they don't need to be employed any longer. And that's one of the barriers, I think, that's actually been there. Because when I spoke to the amenity societies here about this, they're concerned similarly. Was, you know what, trying to keep volunteers out. Sorry. So there are issues around that too. But the point that I was trying to make was, regardless of all of those, bridging that distinction, which is where it comes back to living heritage, bridging the barriers between the voluntary process and the specialist process is actually just something we should be doing anyway, because it leads to a better outcome, regardless of all the issues.
I think it's something that gets more acute in economic downturns every time I think we've got to go on to yeah. Okay, that was great. Thank you everybody.